Hello YouTube. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about a concept that I've been working with as I do some work around ego release. And this is the concept of the hungry ego. So the hungry ego is an idea that I came up with. I mean, I'm sure other people have said similar things, but a way that I've been conceptualizing ego as I try to work through it and understand how I might go about doing some ego release. And maybe this would be helpful for some others as well. So when I think about the ego, I think from the ego's perspective, everything is all about avoiding failure. So the ego is a perfectionist. The ego does not want you to fail or slip up, and if you do, it will be very loud about it. It's the voice on your shoulder that says, hey, you made a mistake, you're a bad person, or you should feel guilty, or you should dwell on it. So it's all about avoiding failure. But the reason that I describe it as the hungry ego is because the fact is, like, the ego can never really be satisfied. The ego can never really have enough. So if the ego is all about avoiding failure, and in theory the way to please the ego would be to avoid failure, but the fact is, I find that even if I succeed, the ego is still chatty. Like, either it wants me to succeed more, to do better, so it says, oh, well, like, that wasn't a real success, or that wasn't that important, or it will, in a weird way, like, make me feel guilty about the success, or guilty about celebrating the success. So like, it wants to punish you for making mistakes, but it doesn't necessarily want to celebrate you doing well. My ego will, like, want me to feel guilty about enjoying success. And, like, in a weirdly paradoxical way, I find that even in doing ego release work, my ego will chide me for not doing a good enough job, right? Like, my ego will say, well, I'm still here, so you're obviously failing at this. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. Like, if you try to feed the ego, it might sometimes result in short-term gains. Maybe you're a little more productive, maybe you do succeed in something, but it's just long-term, like, a lot of anxiety. And so when I'm thinking to myself, like, how do I start a practice of trying to release the ego, I'm really drawn to the archetype of the Page of Pentacles, and specifically Lindsay Mack with, wow, I just blanked, Wild Soul Tarot. Lindsay Mack talks about the Page of Pentacles in her podcast as this archetype that asks tons of foundational questions. So the Page of Pentacles always wants to know, like, why are we here? Why is this structure in place? Why are we doing this? It's kind of those, like, childlike questions, but in a very, like, mature way. It's kind of the way that children can be strangely mature in the kinds of, like, philosophical deep questions they want to know. And the Page of Pentacles has come up as my card for the year, and so I'm really trying to embrace that in coming up against the ego, is to ask the ego questions, gentle questions, not, accusatory questions, but trying to think of questions that I can ask the ego to kind of push a little bit against its default state. So, I guess it's important to me to be gentle in the sense that it's kind of like actually the strength card, the strength archetype, is that you don't want to ignore or try to, like, push away or push down your strong emotions. You want to integrate them and work with them and try to pull them together into who you are. And so I'm trying to be gentle about the things that my ego desires, love, attention, status, recognition, to like be gentle about those, to say these are valid, but also to ask questions that kind of remind myself concretely what happens when I'm pursuing those in an egoic way. So if my ego says, do this and you will like get attention, then I might say, is that the kind of attention I want? Or what has happened in the past? Like, hey ego, have you been happy in the past when I got attention? Did it feel like enough attention? And like the answer is probably no. And then to try to shift the way that I think about those desires. So, I think that the ego at its heart is kind of a perversion of certain totally valid emotions, like fear and desire. And so speaking directly to those emotions and thinking about other ways to get needs met, rather than the egoic default way. So shifting, rather than saying like, I desire love or attention or success or recognition, and I deserve them because of whether I succeed or fail, like rather than making it conditional on what I do, trying to gently shift that to, it's okay to desire these things, but you don't deserve them because of what you do. You deserve them because you're a human being, because you're a being on this planet, and everyone deserves those core things. Now, I think one thing that's key to that is that everyone deserves those things whether or not we get them. And so I think it's easy in some ways, I think that the society we live in, and this kind of like apocalyptic dystopian society we live in, it makes it this really hard because, we experience oppression, we experience loss, we experience marginalization, and it's, I think, hard, like if you keep wanting something and not getting it, that's really tough. And it's a core concept of human rights. The idea is that even if your rights are being violated actively right now, you still have the right, like you still deserve the thing. So this is the same thing. You still deserve love and attention and recognition, but you might not get it. And it's easy over time to get worn down by this, and generationally, not just individually, so that we develop this kind of like almost sinners and saints, like Christian mythology or capitalist mythology around like, if you do well, you'll be rewarded, or if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like we develop this narrative to explain why we don't have things, rather than it being like, we live in a shitty structure, but we still deserve these things. We start to tell ourselves, oh, I didn't deserve it because I failed, or because I didn't earn enough points, or something like that. And like we build the ego as a narrative that I think is a survival mechanism, and totally valid as a survival mechanism. I particularly don't want to say, I'm not one of these people who's like, everything is love and light and positivity, and like, people go through real shit, real trauma, real oppression, and it's not accessible to everyone to be able to do ego release work. Like I'm privileged to be able to do that, but I do think that even if you're in a really tough place, you can do work towards understanding you deserve all these things, even if you're not getting them, and kind of accepting that you won't always get what you desire, but you always deserve to ask. You always have a right to ask. You should never feel bad for asking, or for wanting, or for desiring. And like, I think, like I said, the core of ego is emotion. The core of ego is really fear. And I think often it's fear of not having enough. So it's this like scarcity mentality that can be hard to escape when we're living in this kind of dystopia. But I think people are doing amazing jobs in little pockets in their communities. People are doing amazing jobs of challenging that and bringing about more of an abundance mentality, and thinking like abundance mentality isn't so much about what you have, it's about whatever you have seeing coming from a place of abundance. So even if you have very little, like how can you think about the gifts that you do have? How can you think about the skills and the resources that you do have, tangible and intangible? And building an abundance mentality, I think, can be a powerful means of ego release, because it helps to directly address that fear. It says like your fears are valid, your fears of not having are valid, but like how can you be grateful for what you do have? How can you think about what you do have? And acknowledging that I'm saying this from a place of privilege, and you know, not everyone can access this, but I think it can be powerful practice, whether you have a lot of privilege or have very little privilege, to try to cultivate a mentality of abundance, and learning in your interpersonal relationships. Like it can be very scary to ask for, say, recognition, like to put yourself out there can be super scary and can result in embarrassment and guilt and shame and lots of bad feelings if it doesn't go well. But I think it's important that we have to learn to accept no as a valid response when we ask for something. That's not a judgment against us. You know, if someone is not able to give us attention right now, or someone is not able to give us love right now, it's not a judgment of us. It doesn't mean that we failed. It just means that that person can't offer that at that time. And so practicing asking, practicing hearing both no and yes, practicing that feeling that you do, in fact, whoever you are, you do deserve to have your needs met, can be a way of taking ego out of the picture, and being gentle to the feelings that underlie ego, and incorporating and integrating them into yourself, like the archetype of the Strength card. So yeah, those are my thoughts about this idea of the hungry ego. If that resonated with you, please do leave a comment below and let me know. And if you're doing any kind of ego release work, I'd love to know what practices have worked well for you, and you know, any resources you recommend. All right, don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Bye.